G'day, my name's Steve Weyland and welcome to Two Blokes and a Motorbike. This show's about two mates restoring classic motorcycles from the 70s, the 80s, right up to the late 90s. One bike at a time, because quite frankly, we're easily confused. We've got a lot of experience to draw on, so hopefully you'll come along for the ride and we'll keep it entertaining.
Two Blokes and a Motorbike is brought to you by bikereview.com.au.
In this final episode, we complete our creation. From what was basically a scrounged up pile of parts, we finally produce a living, breathing, born again Suzuki Katana. We're going to start the show with a full disclosure moment, or coming clean as it were. Now that we've reached this point, we're going to refit the front wheel, this time on camera. Now, for those of you who've been following the series, you may recall that we repaired the Speedo drive unit. Well, as it turns out, we didn't. It became apparent that it had more internal issues than North Korea. So we found another good second-hand unit, we painted it silver, and in it goes. The axle is pushed through the drive unit and out through a spacer that protects the wheel bearing. Then through yet another spacer. Next, the fork end caps are fitted to each side and secured with nuts and spring washers. The axle nut is tightened and the Speedo cable fitted. Now that will stay where it's put. Okay, it's time we got this motor running. Firstly, in goes some quality motorcycle oil from a motorcycle shop. If you use cheap car oil from a supermarket, you should be smeared in gravy and dragged through a lion park. The friction modifiers in car oil will make the clutch slip. You will have to throw the fibre clutch plates in the bin and buy new ones. Right, lecture over. Let's have a crack at starting this thing.
Okay, it's time to see if this engine's going to start. It's a bit of a mystery guess to see if it's going to fire up at all. I mean, the wiring loom was a basket case. They had a lot of issues with the carburetors. So yeah, we don't know if it's going to run. The engine should be fine, but there's a lot of other things that can go wrong. So let's see what happens. Shall we have the fuel turned on, please, Steve?
I shall turn the fueleth on. You may notice our professional fuel stand as used by the MotoGP teams. It also doubles as a handy ladder.
The moment of truth. Choke on.
Backfiring like this indicates to us it's got a timing issue. And so Mike sets out to adjust it. And with hands like an experienced safecracker, he gently dials the ignition backing plate just a smidgen until he gets this thing to maintain idle. It fires, it runs, and as you can see, we're pretty bloody happy about it.
These are the real old spark plugs in here. I haven't changed them yet. So
yeah, the dirty old things, and there's a bit of smoke blowing out the back at the moment, but that's understandable because all of this stuff is still full of grease and or oil. That'll blow out. Hopefully it'll clear up. It has new rings in it, so we know it's going to be good in that regard.
I might put the new spark plugs in and we'll give it another go.
Good thinking, 99. And that's exactly what Mike does. Now we've got a couple of other Katanas to resurrect down the track, so it made good economic sense to have all the bodywork professionally painted at the same time. The painter gave us a good deal on 3 sets of tanks and panels, but more importantly, he did a brilliant job. And finally, we can get it on the bike.
Now, with these old bikes, it's best not to do up these bolts too tight on these plastic tabs. They have a tendency to snap off if you overdo it. So just line them all up first before you tighten anything. Make sure they're all going to line up, and then do them up, but not too tight. There are crush tubes in these rubbers to stop you overdoing it, but best not to get carried away.
Once Mike's got the tailpiece firmly in place, we'll move to the front of the bike and fit the uniquely styled front guard. During the early 80s, steel front guards were replaced more and more with plastic ones. However, this left no bracing strength between the forks, so alloy or steel brackets like this one were often part of the design, adding even more weight. Two sets of eyes are helpful when installing a Katana front guard, as you have to gently squeeze both sides in while you slide it back between the forks. Carelessly scratching the freshly painted front guard or forks at this point would be most embarrassing and probably have you talked about down at the club. Once it's lined up, then you need to also bolt on the front brake hose guides in the same holes. Very fiddly. And while the guard brace may be out of sight, we've still painted it to prevent corrosion. The exposed brackets were painted as well, and their job is to keep the brake hoses away from the front wheel. I have no explanation for this other than Mike's piles must have been playing up. Time to reveal the tank. We've gone with the blue stripes, which were standard fitment on the later 750 and 1000cc models in Australia. A subtle difference to plain silver, but unlike Mike, they look pretty cool. While the top fairing has matching stripes and the standard black around the headlight.
I'll just show you what we did to get this ready. Firstly, I put the indicators on both sides there and got them nice and flat, so they're not pointing up and down. If you look from the top, they're fairly even as well. They're just a matter of bolts and washers on the inside. Then I fitted that bottom cowling bit there that stops the water and wind rushing up.
Now, we've argued about this. I thought it was there to stop possums and such from scurrying up the fork legs, but alas, we'll never know. And then these top fairing brackets which hold the screen, they just bolt on underneath there, just 4 bolts. And now she's, and of course the flaps down the bottom there, the shark fins, or whatever you want to call them, they bolt on with the same bolts that little plate goes on there. So she's all ready to go on the bike. So the fairing goes on first, followed by the fuel tank. It pays to connect your indicator wires and check everything works before screwing it all in place. Oh, and don't over tighten the screws or you'll end up with cracks in your paintwork. To the untrained eye, the part Mike is fitting here might at a glance look like an oil cooler, but it serves no purpose at all other than to cover up an empty space, like a baseball cap on a bogan. Thankfully it's plastic, so it doesn't add any more weight to the bike. The underfairing side panels are a simple push-on fit. Just to be sure nothing breaks, grease the 3 lugs that hold them on. We replaced all the rubber fairing grommets with new ones so they're soft and pliable. Again, these panels are purely for looks, but the overall styling is what makes a Katana a Katana. And Mike gives his now famous tap of approval. British bikes were all the rage for a long time. Bikes like these, from the 40s, 50s, 60s and 70s. It was in the 70s that the Japanese built their first superbikes, but then in the 80s they really hit their stride. They churned out models with new features like fuel injection, 16-inch front wheels, turbocharging. We had 4-cylinder 250s, we had 6-cylinder 1000s. There were liquid-cooled 4-strokes, V4 2-strokes. In the 80s, the Japanese factories were a total enigma. It was like watching a stroke victim on a pogo stick. You never knew which direction they were heading next. For this series, we've started out with a fairly popular bike to restore, and that will be our practice in the future. And whether it's Japanese or European, they'll all be treated with the respect they deserve. And all going to plan, they'll all turn out at least as good as this Katana. Right, let's get the fuel tap on the tank.
We've had this cleaned up and vapor blasted, got a new O-ring there, and there's new washers for the bolts, because they need to be proper fibre washers so the fuel don't leak.
Katanas have a vacuum operated tap, which means you don't turn them off. Fuel only runs through it when the motor is running, or when you've got it on prime. Up until recently, brand new Suzuki Katana tanks were still available. When Mike suggested we buy one, I said, why? There'll always be plenty of second-hand tanks around. To which he replied, that's what they said in Germany in 1945. I've got to be careful or we'll have BMW on the phone. Next to go on is the front bracket that holds the seat into position. And guess what? We've painted that too. Time to get the tank on and make this look like a proper motorcycle. We gently place it between the fairing brackets so as not to scratch anything, of course, and then slide the tank forward onto two rubber pads either side of the frame. The rear is secured by 2 bolts and rests on rubber cushions. Fuel tanks on 70s and early 80s bikes formed a major part of the design, where in later years big alloy frames and fairings tended to draw the eye. Jumping on a bike, the first thing you're looking at is the tank, so any dents or scratches tend to draw the attention. Having a new or freshly painted filler cap and flawless paintwork with correctly placed stickers or decals if you prefer is a crucial part of any bike restoration. But before we bolt it down, we have to connect both the fuel and vacuum hoses from the carbies. And as everyone knows, this is what your rubber mallet is actually designed for. And with the tank secured, we'll move on to the side covers.
Now it's time to fit these side covers. I've assembled these already, so I've put on the choke actuator, the switch blocks, switch thing there that do nothing but can do something, and yeah, she's all ready to go on. So we need to connect the choke cable to the back of this, so we'll get in there and get him on like that. So he's on, and it's just a matter of lining up the rubbers to the pins.
Suzuki actually had the foresight to incorporate 2 buttons on the side cover, which were actual switches for accessory items, just in case you wanted to fit something like fog lamps, or a GPS, or even a dash cam. Don't tell me the Katana wasn't ahead of its time. However, the buttons on the right hand side are just like faith healers. They're fake and don't do anything. Next, the screen goes on the bike, and in keeping with the rest of the build, it's an unscratched new one.
Okay, we're just going to finish putting on the moulding onto the screen here. Now they're very hard to get on, and a trick that I've learned is to soak the moulding in hot water for about 5 minutes before you try and get it on. It makes the job a whole lot easier. So we've got most of it on now, so we'll just finish getting this all the way into the corners there. And now the screen's got the moulding all around it, ready to go.
There are 4 stepped rubber cushions that go between the brackets and the screen. Oh, and trust me, if one of these drops to the workshop floor, you will never, ever find it again. Unless you've sold the bike. Then you'll find it. We like to use a dab of thread locking compound on the screen screws. That's because you don't want to over tighten them, but you also don't want them to vibrate out. Too much pressure and in no time you'll develop cracks around your holes. Very unsightly. While this is an aftermarket screen, it is the same tint as the original, and thankfully they're still readily available. The mirrors on a Katana were quite unique. That's because the handlebars were the low-slung clip-on style. The mirrors were mounted on the bars and not the fairing, which means the stems had to follow a rather kooky angle for you to see past your elbows. There are many mirrors that will fit, but won't sit at the correct angle. Fortunately, the genuine Suzuki mirrors are still available. They fit, they look right, and most importantly, they're much more solid than cheaper aftermarket items, so they don't vibrate. We recommend spend that little bit extra and buy genuine if you can. And of course, the final touch. It wouldn't be a GSX without the shiny cam end caps, which contrast beautifully with our black motor. If you cast your mind back and consider how this all began, this bike didn't even exist. We bought a motor from one bloke and a pile of bits from another. Through the series, we've moved step by step to create a complete motorcycle, and we've finally achieved our goal. As a viewer, you've seen all the components come together, and hopefully picked up some tips along the way. You might have even been inspired to get back into the shed and finish a project you started long ago, or you just might want to take on a new one. Or perhaps you're just content to watch these two blokes skin our knuckles and sweat and swear as we continue resurrecting classic bikes. So now, without further ado, it's time to reveal this Katana in all its glory. Okay, it's time to recap. Well, as you can see, we fitted the seat. After trying a few different colours on the bike, we opted for this freshly upholstered black one. The magnificent paintwork was by a local professional. Except for the blue stripe kit, which Mike sourced from Canada, the stickers were genuine Suzuki items. In our past experience, aftermarket stickers can cause the clear coat to react and bubble up when it's applied over them. Then the painter has to start over again. So it's a good idea to go with originals if you can still source them. The old motor you saw at the beginning of this series was opened up and anything it needed was done. For example, the piston rings were replaced, the valves were reground, and fresh gaskets and O-rings were fitted throughout. You don't want to go to all this trouble and end up with oil leaks. The mechanic also painted the motor with heat-proof engine enamel before reassembly. The alloy engine covers were polished and capped off with contrasting black Suzuki badges. The stainless 4x1 exhaust system was fitted with a custom, locally made and locally chromed muffler. The fork legs, as you can see, were painted black, as were the triple clamps, the chain guard and the brake calipers. Of course, all of these things cost money, but looking at the overall result, we think money well spent. It's time to get the bike out on the road and see what falls off. Hopefully it isn't me. A quick run around the suburban streets doesn't reveal any dramas, so let's get this thing out into its natural habitat. The higher speed limits out here allow me to rev the bike more, and any engine issues should come to light. It also gives me a chance to test the suspension settings and the brake effectiveness. A bike should be able to run out to redline without any flat spots or hiccups. However, a freshly put together motor with new rings, etc. should be treated with respect to bed things in. So I'll take it easy initially, plus I'm on 2 new tyres, and we have new brake pads to bed into the discs, so steady as she goes. You know, a 750 Katana was considered a sports bike in its day, and not ideal for touring or commuting, but I have to say, compared to a lot of later race replica type bikes, it's not too bad. The seat is low and still relatively big and plush, and I don't have a lot of weight on my wrists or my nose on the front wheel. And sure, it's long and heavy and underpowered by today's standards. The frame can flex, the front wheel is too big, and the brakes are at best average. But only if you compare it to modern bikes. In its day, it was quite a successful race bike and commanded a lot of respect on the road. You don't have to try to be fast. Riding an 80s bike can be quite relaxing if you like to just cruise around and take in the scenery. They didn't have the best handling or brakes, so it's just nice to potter along sometimes and not ride the bike beyond its limits. But should you decide to give it the berries, feed it the fat, turn up the wick, or just give it the bejesus, it's always nice to know that it's got plenty more when you need it. I have to say I'm pretty impressed. This bike rides as well as it looks. It's so good it's even enough to tempt Mike out of the workshop. That's right, that's the man himself on the bike. The hardest part, of course, was getting him back off it. If you're planning to restore a bike to make a profit, bear in mind that these days, 99% of the time, you won't. You have to outlay so much just to buy one to start with. The parts are expensive and you'll always need more of them than you planned on. And there's always extra costs. We had to pay a professional mechanic to balance the carbies, and we had to get the bike inspected and registered for the road. More money, more time. So, what happened with this Katana? We put it up for auction on the internet and sold it. Out of respect to the happy new owner in Victoria, we won't say what he paid. Besides, his partner may not know. What we can say is that after totalling all that we spent on it, we made a tidy profit of about $100 each. Ka-ching! And that's not allowing for any of our labour time. So for us, it was more about the love of bikes and the gratification that comes from saving a bunch of parts from the scrap heap and getting another old bike back on the road. We know a lot of viewers out there are die-hard Katana owners who probably know a lot more than we do, but as I said at the beginning, to the purists among you, this was never going to be a full concourse restoration. We'd call it a tastefully customised rebuild. For example, the 750 Katanas had an 18-inch rear wheel. We couldn't find one, so we had to run with a 17-inch from an 1100 model. Don't ask me why they ran a different size. And as to the front brakes, that bastard anti-dive system proved to be our nemesis yet again. So we'll come back to this later and you can see how we fixed it. In the end, out of frustration, we replaced the 40-year-old rubber hoses with a set of braided lines off another bike, and we finally had some front brake. And there are other differences too, and I'm sure we'll get the feedback. Which brings me to my last point. I may be a comedian, but I'm serious when I say you do your restoration however you want. Then pat yourself on the back, sit back and soak up the view. Time to kick back with a glass or two of chuckle juice and reflect. It was Churchill who said, when you're going through hell, keep going. He wasn't talking about marriage, it was about, clearly, motorcycle restoration, which can be an arduous task. And like a marriage, it only works if passion's involved. A bike that's been slapped together without it is pointless. I find if you keep in mind what you're restoring it for, it keeps you motivated. Is it because you used to have one back in your younger days and you want to relive your youth? Are you going to ride it, or are you just going to keep it in the garage to admire forevermore? Or is it because you want to on-sell it to someone who'll appreciate all the careful hard work you've put in? To be honest, we built this Katana to on-sell, but we did everything the same as if we were going to keep it. We didn't cut any corners on this build. We used genuine parts where we could and top quality aftermarket parts where we couldn't, like the chain and sprockets and the shock absorbers. We took our time to do it right. This was never going to be some crap reality show where we had to work within a budget or to some fictitious deadline to build the drama. It was about two blokes with a passion to build a great motorcycle. And we reckon we've accomplished exactly that. Thanks for watching. We hope to see you again soon. Cheers. Whatever your next project is, don't forget to have fun while you're doing it, because life's too short to be serious.
Two Blokes and a Motorbike is brought to you by bikereview.com.au.
Can you imagine anyone in 40 years passionately restoring an electric bike? Master technician. I'm filming and I've just got Teresa's face in it.
Sorry.
Sound like Russell Coy at the end.
Close enough.